So you mentioned the form of dialogue. So when you were giving the lecture, you mentioned that you're not, in fact, engaging in a monologue, because by looking and seeing our reactions, you're constantly modifying your speech. I was wondering if you could speak out, because I'm probably the only millennial in this room. Or no, one more. But as someone who's kind of grown up in the internet and who in fact has social media, do you think sites like Facebook and not so much Twitter, but basically Facebook, do they stop this dialogue? Or how do you, what are the ramifications of such things if people are communicating with each other without really being in the same room? What for you is lost?
I think it's sort of analogous to the danger of derivatives in the financial market. You know, because like a derivative is something that can amplify the degree to which the market moves, right? Because it's an abstraction from the underlying reality. So it's more powerful for good and it's more powerful for evil. And I would say, so to speak, you know, if you're thinking about it metaphorically, well, it's an amplifier. And that can be a good thing, but it can also be a bad thing. And I think it does often amplify the proclivity of people to disappear into a self-reflective bubble, and that's aided by the algorithms that feed to you what you want to see. So, and we don't know exactly what that's going to do. It's not it's a very dangerous thing, because we're building an unconscious into the internet, and no one's going to understand how it works, because it gets more and more complex, especially when AI kicks in a big way, because you can't understand how those systems work, even though they work. And the problem with that unconscious in the internet is it filters information, and you don't know what the filtering is. I mean, you don't know what your own filtering is, you know, because you're not conscious of your underlying processes. But this adds a whole new dimension to it, and the fact that it's self-fulfilling in some sense increases the probability of positive feedback loops that will go out of control.
So do you think that it kind of locks you into your own, maybe the story of your own life? Because I'm not a personally not a frequent social media user, but I see it as, you know, people posting about themselves, their relationships, and do you think it creates a constant feedback loop that it's kind of like, I'm thinking of it's not Oedipus, it's the guy that looks...
Narcissus.
You're looking at your own reflection in the mirror, and that you are in fact...
Well, I think what happens is that...
You're not allowing other...
I think that is a danger. I also think, though, is that you also fall prone to the implicit narcissism of all the other Facebook users. And well, because people generally post glowing reviews of their own life, and you know, to some degree that's understandable, because who wants to be subject to a constant barrage of misery? I mean, there's reasons that people do it. They post themselves when they're having fun, when they're doing something spectacular, but that also means that you're being blasted all the time by these endless images of other people having a far better time of life than you are. And so I think that we do know that there is some evidence that more exposure to Facebook means more depression. Now, it's hard to pull out correlation and causality there, but then in the political sphere you have the same problem, because you're not being fed an unbiased sample of information, and your own initial biases are multiplied by the algorithms that select for you what you're going to look at, and we don't know, we have no idea what the consequence of that is. So Christina?
Thank you very much. Incidentally, I have a question that concerns something similar, but I'm talking about the real face-to-face conversation. You said how important it is for you as a speaker to get the feedback of your audience. Now, having grown up in East Germany, we have learned to look with no expression whatsoever at the most outrageous, stupid things. Because the consequences of like rolling your eyes when they were talking about us being well ahead economically of the West would be just very negative, so we didn't do that. And I see something very similar happening here in especially certain political lectures. So if somebody tells you that what you are doing, or tells an audience what you are doing is horrible, and I'm in that audience, I wouldn't roll my eyes, because I know what the consequences are. Now, of course,
those are microaggressions.
Yeah.
Yeah, really, I'm not kidding. I mean, that's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
Eye rolling in particular is a sign of contempt. And,
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, but of course, if I never do that to you, you now get the impression that what you say is just wonderful. So you
Yeah.
don't get the critical feedback that is, as you pointed out rightly, very important for you.
yes,
And
well,
of course, that goes both ways.
yes, it's actually one of the fundamental defenses of free speech is that if you constrain it, you're depriving people of corrective feedback, and that's a very bad thing because people cannot maintain sanity in isolation. You outsource your sanity to other people. If you're vaguely socially acceptable, what that means is people can tolerate having you around, and then they will provide you with corrective feedback, and as long as you react to that, you don't have to worry about being sane because they'll keep you that way. And you might think, well, no, you can manage your sanity by yourself, but no, it's too complex. You can't. It's not possible.
So the problem is not just inhibiting free speech, but also inhibiting natural reaction to speech.
Absolutely. Well, and the spontaneous reactions, right? Because a lot of those facial gestures, those aren't precisely conscious, and that's actually good because they're untrammeled expressions of your initial instincts, something like that. You know, it's like having dogs around. You know, if you're agitated and upset, the dog will get all nervous. It's like, well, you can trust that. The dog doesn't have an agenda. You know, and people are like that in their initial responses too, because that doesn't mean they're correct, but at least it means that it's not mediated by like an ideological bias, or not so straightforwardly.
Just before we hear from Eva, I wanted to mention that we let our hypotheses die in our stead.
Yes.
Is Karl Popper, one
Popper,
of my
yes.
favorite philosophers.
Right, Popper, yes.
I was just talking to it.
First of all, I want to thank you for a most interesting presentation and on a line which a lot of us here haven't heard before. So I thank you for that. And the two things that I wanted to ask you about. One, the concept that you've enunciated of the emergence over an extremely long period of time of the idea that we all have somewhat of the divine in us, which I suppose also implies that we have somewhat of the opposite as well.
Yeah, it does
all of
imply
us,
that.
leads directly to the idea of individual rights versus group rights.
Yes.
And a lot of the troubles that all of us here faced is that we have become the target of these group demands for group rights rather than individual rights, us all attaining or not that march towards the higher hierarchies of society based on our own efforts and our own performances and so on. So that's one, but that's also the other side of another thing that you raised, which one rarely hears in any of these kinds of meetings, the biological basis of our behavior. And I was really interested to hear you bring this into the discussion, because it has seemed to me over the years, and I've been around this business since the 60s, I think, when all the troubles seem to have started, is that a lot of the feminism nonsense is involved with the denial of differences between males and females. Mm-hmm. A lot of the problems with the performance and affirmative action and so on is the denial that there may be biological bases to some of the performance differences that we see in various fields of activity around the world. And also this idea that we can decide what gender we are tomorrow morning, and that I must say I'd never heard of this. What did you call it? The gender unicorn. And I will be
Hey,
going
look
to
it
look
up,
that
man.
up when I go. And the idea
very
that
instructive.
5-year-olds and 6-year-olds will be subjected to this is positively alarming. So I just ask you to comment on all this.
Yeah, well, they call that biological essentialism, right? And so that's a curse word essentially, right? So, and again, that's partly why I objected to the legislation and surrounding policy, because it doesn't allow for a biological influence, and so, which is preposterous in my estimation. And I mean, the biology actually is much more useful than people even realize. So, you know, one of the things we were talking about earlier today was, say, the distinction between conservatives and liberals. And I can tell you one of the things that produces right-wing authoritarianism, it's very interesting, and you wouldn't guess this in a million years, prevalence of infectious disease. So there was a great paper published 3 years ago, it was brilliant, prevalence of infectious disease. So it was published in a journal called PLOS One, and these researchers were interested in this hypothesis called the behavioral immune system. And so you know very frequently when heretofore isolated human groups come into contact that either one group or the other dies, like maybe all of them or virtually all of them. That's essentially what happened to the Native Americans when the Spaniards hit Central America, right? Because they didn't have any built-in immunity to smallpox or chickenpox or mumps or measles, and like successive epidemics just wiped them out. The estimates vary, but it could be as high as 95%. And so it appears as though the border idea, the idea of thick borders, let's say, which is a fundamentally conservative idea. The liberals want open borders and a lot of information flow, and the conservatives want closed borders and more restriction and protection at every level of the conceptual hierarchy. It's not just political borders, it's borders around everything. But that seems to be tightly associated, at least in part, with the prevalence of infectious disease, both at the country level and at the local level within countries. And the correlation's like 0.7. It's not trivial, and it's not with governmental authoritarian attitudes, it's with individual authoritarian attitudes in the locales where the infectious diseases are prevalent. And it seems to be associated with the emotion of disgust. So Hitler wasn't afraid of the Jews. Conservatives aren't afraid of others. That isn't how it works. They're disgusted. That's not the same thing. It's associated with a personality trait called orderliness. And so once this has been sorted out by psychologists over about the last 10 years, let's say, and when I was plowing through the literature and working on the relationship between disgust sensitivity and personality, I happened to reread Hitler's Table Talk, which was a collection of his spontaneous speeches collected at dinner time, lunch times by secretaries from 1939 to 1942. And once I knew this other information, it just leapt out at me, you know. So Hitler was admirer of willpower. That makes him a conscientious type of person. Very obsessed with order, washed his hands continually, was hyper clean, and disgust sensitive. And his primary metaphor for the German people was a body, Aryan body, pure body, under assault by parasites. It's pure disgust and contamination language, and it's mediated by disgust sensitivity, and that's one of the things that predicts that kind of right-wing, close-the-border attitude, and that's also heightened in places where infectious diseases are a real problem. So if you want to eliminate right-wing authoritarianism, it actually looks like one of the things you could do is promote public health programs everywhere to rid the world of it, to the degree that that's possible, of infectious diseases. Well, you know, you want to impede the flow between people if there's infectious diseases everywhere, obviously, and that manifests itself in political attitudes. So the biology reaches way deeper than people are willing to, like to assume. But some of the things that it tells us are unbelievably useful to know. I mean, terrible to know in some sense, but useful to know. And so, and like de Waal's work on the stability of primate hierarchies is incredibly important. I mean, he's been looking at the emergence of proto-morality among chimpanzees, and that seems to be driven in large part by the dominance hierarchy structure. It's not exactly a dominance hierarchy either. That's probably not exactly the right way to think about it, because, you know, dominance implies pure power, but lots of human hierarchies aren't dominance hierarchies at all. They're competence hierarchies or something like that, so it's very different. So